Florida, the most geographically southern state in the continental U.S. Wildly popular, hotly debated. Is it the South or is it something else? When you ask an American, you're going to get a whole slew of answers. For some, it is a definitive yes. Others, it's absolutely not the South. And then there's the phrase that the further north you go in Florida, the more southern it is. Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at some of those reasons as to why Florida is different from the rest of the South. Like the video and subscribe if you love the content, and let's get into it. First, let's talk about these pseudo cities or places in Florida. Fake Florida cities, as I like to call them. Officially called census designated places by the U.S. Census Bureau, though some of them, such as Port St. Lucie, actually are incorporated as cities. These places embody the pinnacle of American-style post-World War II suburbia, absolutely sprawling masses upon masses of nearly identical single-family homes, with no real entertainment nor central core business district. The developers were given open reign with the land in Florida, and they went absolutely nuts with it. It looks like someone played SimCity and dragged a low-density residential zone across the whole map. You can find them all over the state. Places like Palm Coast, Cape Coral, Deltona, Spring Hill, Weston, Port St. Lucie, and countless more. Some, such as Parkland, even have the nerve to have gated enclaves within an already suburban enclave. And don't even get me started on the armpit of the state, Lehigh Acres. It might just be the most depressing place I've ever visited. A subscriber asked me on my Palm Coast video where was the downtown. Well, my friend, there isn't one. At best, you might get a Walmart here, a Home Depot there, and hey, it is Florida, so you know there's a Publix somewhere nearby. Some of them have very large populations also, so these aren't just any small suburbs. Port St. Lucie and Cape Coral have well over 200,000 people, and the latter is one of the fastest growing so-called cities in the state. Florida, the land of the cities that are not actually cities. You won't really find these much anywhere else in the South. Even with modern suburbia, you can still find a historic downtown in most southern cities outside of Florida. Most of the rest of the South was settled earlier in American history, and a large amount of these places being designed this way can be attributed to them being developed after World War II and a federally subsidized suburban housing boom. Now, I know a lot of people will criticize this style of development, but a lot of Americans seem to love it as they keep on moving there. To each his own. The next, and one of the most obvious ways that Florida is different, is the climate. The majority of the southern states have a humid subtropical climate. The humid subtropical climate is characterized by relatively mild winters with hot, humid summers. If you grew up in the South and you're familiar with those summers, and AC is a must. Snow comes occasionally, but is rare enough to where a few inches can shut an entire city down. This climate totally dominates the southeastern U.S. and even northern Florida. But continuing further south into Florida, you encounter a climate that can't be found anywhere else in the country outside of Hawaii, the tropical climate. In fact, Florida is the furthest north that the global tropical climate reaches. The tropical climate consists of year-round warm weather, with average temperatures in South Florida being around 65 degrees. There is a wet season from May through October and a dry season from November through April. When the rest of the country is freezing in January, South Florida is warm and sunny. Snow is extremely rare, and even during the summer months, you rarely will see temperatures exceed 100 degrees in the state. This has no doubt contributed to Florida being the #1 state in the country for domestic tourism. So many Americans flock to the state during the winter months that the term snowbird has been coined to describe those from colder regions of the country who visit the area or own second homes there to vacation for the winter. Some even come from as far north as Canada. During the winter months in Florida, the population swells, the traffic gets heavier, and prices get higher. Young 20-somethings also come flood the state's beaches for spring break towards the end of the winter. And the downside of Florida's tropical climate, being flanked by two large warm bodies of water, is the hurricanes. Now, the entire Gulf Coast and the southeastern Atlantic coast is also prone to hurricanes as well. And trust me, being from North Carolina, I know a thing or two about hurricanes myself. But Florida takes hits from hurricanes more than any other state. They can come from the west via the Gulf of Mexico, or they can attack the state from along the Atlantic coast. And with the low elevation, they can be especially devastating to the state. And elevation brings us to the next reason Florida is different, and that is the geography. Most of the South consists of either Atlantic or Gulf coastal plain, with a hilly Piedmont that eventually transitions to mountains and higher elevations as you move inland. Well, Florida is different. Mountains are a foreign concept in Florida. Britton Hill in the Florida Panhandle is the highest point in the state at only 345 feet, making it the lowest, high point in any state. Most of Florida is at or below sea level, and there are tons of inland lakes, especially in the Orlando area. And new lakes can appear randomly in the form of sinkholes around Florida. And we can't forget about Lake Okeechobee, the eye of Florida, if you will. And Florida is also the flattest of all U.S. states. Being flanked by two large bodies of water gives Florida a unique east and west coastline, while other states have at most one. Beaches line significant portions of both coastlines to where many major cities in Florida have their own beach. And even residents in the interior parts of the state are never more than an hour or two from a beach. The next way that Florida is different is the sheer number of people who are recent transplants to the state. For the past 50 years, Florida has been one of the fastest growing states in the country, going from a swamp-filled wasteland to today being one of the most populated states in the entire nation. At over 21 million people in 2020, it is now third only to California and Texas. Now, this isn't because the people in Florida just have some ridiculously high birth rates, but is instead due to the large amounts of in-migration from other parts of the country, especially the colder northeastern and midwestern states. Miami, the state's largest metro, is often referred to as New York City South. You can see this with many Florida sports teams as they are heavily populated with fair weather fans or fans of teams from other states. Miami Heat games are known for the fans leaving the arena well before the game is over, unless the team happens to be winning. And has anyone actually heard of a Tampa Bay Bucs fan before Tom Brady went there? While many other states in the South are also experiencing a large influx of transplants as Americans flee the Northeast and Midwest, none are quite like Florida. Most other southern states had a somewhat more established culture prior to this modern wave of migration. So usually in states like Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, most transplants will be found around the major metro areas. But in Florida, the vast majority of the state, outside the Panhandle, has been built by and is dominated by transplants. Its vast amount of beaches and year-round warm weather has made it a top choice for retirees from other states. And the amount of transplants also leads us into the next difference, the demographics. Now, Florida, like we saw in Texas, does not have the typical white-black American-dominated mixture that most other southern states do. Texas had a large Hispanic population that dominated many parts of the state, but Florida is not only different from Texas, but almost every other state as well. In 2020, Florida was around 52% non-Hispanic white, 27% Hispanic, and 15% black. But also unique to Florida is a significant mixed race population, which was around 16%. So it appears that the folks in Florida are getting along in more ways than one. Now, if you're wondering why the percentages don't add up to 100, Hispanic is not considered a race, so some of the mixed race population can also be Hispanic. It's also important to note the makeup of these groups in Florida. Florida has a significant population of people from Latin America, so much of the Hispanic population here is Cuban, along with many other South American countries. There are entire enclaves of Brazilians in South Florida, for example. Cubans typically dominate Miami, while the Orlando area is popular with Puerto Ricans. And you can also find Venezuelans, Colombians, Dominicans, and such in the area. In many parts of Miami, Spanish is the more dominant language over English. This is unique to Florida in that the vast majority of the Hispanic population you'll find in other southern states is from Mexico. Some of the black population is also different from the South, in that many are not only of Black American descent, but instead from various Caribbean islands such as Haiti. You'll find many Haitians scattered around the state, especially in South Florida. In the early 20th century, Florida's black population was close to 50%, but many left the state due to segregation and job opportunities in the Midwest and Northeast at the time. Outside of Texas, Florida's non-Hispanic white population is somewhat similar to that of most other southern states. But the big difference is the population split between Hispanic and black. The other demographic difference with Florida is the age of the population. Florida has the second highest percentage of population over 65 in the country at 21.3%, only behind Maine. The only other southern state to make the top 10 is South Carolina at number 10 with 18.7% of people over 65. And this is largely due to the state's popularity with retirees. Make your money up north, retire to Florida to enjoy it. And this has contributed to the next thing on the list, and that is the in-state cultural differences. While in most other southern states, the culture doesn't vary much from one end of the state to the other, in Florida there's a definite difference between the northern and southern parts of the state. The popular phrase is that the further north you go in Florida, the more southern it is. Or that North Florida is where the southerners live, and South Florida is where the northerners live. North Florida will actually look and feel like neighboring Alabama and Georgia, culturally. Panama City Beach is known as Alabama's most popular beach. This is also the part of the state where you'll find the least amount of transplants, and much of the population has been there for several generations. North Florida can be summarized as the stereotypical country part of Florida that's associated with what most people believe it means to be Southern. While down in South Florida, as some say, it's like a whole different country. As we talked about earlier in the video, you have the huge amounts of immigrants from Cuba and other Latin American countries, along with the large amount of transplants from northern states. As a result, you get a much more modern cosmopolitan feel with all these different cultures mashed together. It's pretty much like New York mixed in with Latin America. Now, up in North Florida, you can find that old southern accent, sweet potato pie, collard greens, and sweet tea. But down in the South, you're more likely to encounter that New York accent, and it's easier to find a Cuban sandwich than it is some good old southern fried chicken. Not to mention the drivers. I always say that South Florida drivers are basically how New Yorkers would drive if they had more space. One could say that Miami is the capital city of Latin America. In the other southern states, you won't see these types of differences. In states such as Georgia, Tennessee, etc., you'll see more of a rural-urban cultural divide, with the urban areas being heavily populated with recent transplants and are often referred to as the New South, while the rural areas are more of what people consider the Old South. Up next is the history of Florida. Most of the southern U.S. was colonized by the British, with the exception of Louisiana, but Florida, on the other hand, belonged to Spain. The Spanish actually arrived and settled in Florida before the British did 13 colonies, with America's oldest city of St. Augustine, Florida, being established in 1565. Spanish Florida included the present-day Gulf Coast areas of Mississippi and Alabama. President James Madison took West Florida from Spain and declared it a part of the Louisiana Territory. And by 1819, Spain was no longer able to manage Florida and ceded it to the United States, to which it then achieved territory status. After a series of wars with Seminole tribes in Florida, which ultimately led to their removal to the so-called Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, South Florida finally saw its first European settlements in the 1840s, making Florida a much younger state than the rest of the South in terms of development. Ironically, Florida was actually known as the least populated and most desolate state in the South up until the mid-20th century. In 1900, 44% of the state's population was black, by far the highest of any state. While most of the South had at least some major cities and towns of significance, Florida was known as a hot, swampy wasteland. Then came the invention that changed everything: the air conditioner. In the second half of the 20th century, Florida became a boom state with massive amounts of migration from the declining Rust Belt and the colder Northeast. Many Cubans also fled to the state to escape from the Castro regime. So in essence, one could say that Florida is newer than all the other southern states. Florida's newness, combined with its history as a Spanish rather than a British colony, sets it apart from the rest of the South. The next reason why Florida is not like the rest: toll roads. In most of the South, you can easily drive all over the state without having a toll transponder. Most of the major highways were built with federal funds for the interstate highway system in the late 20th century. In fact, being from North Carolina, I never even purchased a toll transponder until I visited Florida. While Florida's main highway of Interstate 95 is free, along with most of the major routes in Florida, overall, you're still going to have a painful time in Florida if you choose to only drive on the free roads. Exhibit A, Orlando. Orlando has perhaps the heaviest concentration of toll roads in the entire United States. Only Interstate 4 is free through the area. The Turnpike, the East-West Expressway, and even its Beltway are all tolled. And if you want the more peaceful drive down I-4, you'll have to pay tolls to travel on its express lanes that run down the middle. Expressways in the Tampa suburbs, the Polk Parkway around Lakeland, and the Sunshine Skyway also require tolls. And if you want to travel between Tampa and Miami, you'll be paying to drive down Alligator Alley. Or you can choose a painfully slow trip down US 41, should you try to avoid it. Orlando to Miami is also tolled via Florida's Turnpike. This one is of particular note, as there aren't really any viable alternatives to avoiding the Turnpike between these two cities. Then down in the Miami area itself, I-95 is indeed a free route, but a lot of the other transportation around the metro requires tolls. Jacksonville and other parts of North Florida are probably the best bet for escaping paying tolls, as only a few routes in these parts are tolled. So one could say there's a northern and southern divide in Florida when it comes to tolls as well. So why so many tolls in Florida? Well, Florida, for one, doesn't levy a state income tax on its citizens. Other states usually use these taxes to help build roads and other infrastructure. So with that revenue not being here, additional user fees must be generated to make up for it. And then, due to Florida being a major tourist destination, The toll roads are a good way to pass the cost of railway building and maintenance on to the out-of-state population that floods the state during the winter season, rather than Florida residents. And this especially makes sense when you consider that the Orlando area is a year-round major tourist destination. And the next difference between Florida and other southern states is the relatively small state capital. I say relative because while Tallahassee isn't the smallest state capital in the South, it is the smallest one relative to the other cities and metros that dominate its state. In most southern states, the capital city is usually among the top 2 or 3 metros in the state. Well, in Florida, that is not the case. Tallahassee ranks behind Miami, Tampa Bay, Orlando, Jacksonville, Sarasota, Fort Myers, and so many more, to the point where it is completely dwarfed in its own state, unlike any other capital city in the South. If not for being the capital city, Tallahassee might not have any influence at all in the state. Florida State is a prominent university in the state, however. Florida is probably the only southern state where the capital city rarely, if ever, comes to mind when one hears that state name mentioned. Does the governor of Florida even want to live in Tallahassee? And for our final reason, I always have to bring it back to the infrastructure. When it comes to infrastructure, what Florida has that the rest of the South does not is high-speed rail. Yes, Florida, with all of its suburbia and major highways, is the first state in the South to have what we call high-speed rail, at least by American standards. Enter Brightline, currently running from Miami to Orlando with stops in Aventura, Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, and West Palm Beach along the way. Brightline is a high-speed train offering a premium trip around the Miami South Florida metro with service all the way up to Central Florida and Orlando. This isn't your typical low-grade public transit offering. It is not as slow and cumbersome as Amtrak. And you can actually get to your destination in time frames that are as good as or better than driving. And your legs won't fall asleep due to the lack of space like it does on a typical airline, unless you take out a second mortgage to fly first class. While in the rest of the South, your train experience is at best something you might do once just to do it. Brightline is actually practical for use over driving or flying in certain instances. Trains, planes, and automobiles are all on the table as options in Florida, while in the rest of the South, it's mostly just automobiles or planes. High-speed rail, only in Florida. And there we have it, guys, how Florida is not like the rest of the South. Do you think Florida is southern, or is it something else? What other ways do you think is different from the other southern states? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.